Ukraine's gained 40 square miles. It has been Ukraine moving forward and Russia pushing back. We know that Russia is still losing over 1,000 men a day on the front line, and they can barely replace about 20% of them. Cracks seem to be appearing. The fact that he is rarely seen these days and does appear to be hiding away, nobody is believing him. And I don't even suppose people in Russia are believing him anymore. I think that the huge strikes on Kyiv last night and actually during the day, and it's very significant they were day and night, so I'll just come back to that. But I think it really shows you what the state of the war is. You know, a few days ago, after the end of the victory parade, President Putin was saying the war is nearly over, it's coming to an end. He had a ceasefire, which for his victory parade, which ultimately had to be organized by Trump. And also President Zelensky very publicly around the world said he would give permission for the victory parade to take place, the most important day in the Russian calendar, where they remember the 26 million people who died in the Second World War fighting the Nazis. The fact that the parade was so scaled down, didn't even have any tanks, which are synonymous with the Russian effort, because in the area they're fighting at the moment around Kursk is where the Russians started the defeat of the Nazis in 1943 with 6,000 tanks. The fact they can't even put one tank on the parade ground in Moscow says an awful lot. The fact that the parade was so scaled back because Putin almost admitted he couldn't protect Moscow despite bringing lots of air defense weapons from the front lines back into Moscow, again, really shows what the state of the war is. And you look at the front lines themselves, you know, really this year, it has been Ukraine moving forward and Russia pushing back. Even in the last few weeks, there are claims that Ukraine's gained 40 square miles, which might not seem a lot from a tactical perspective, but from a strategic perspective, it is absolutely massive. And we know that Russia is still losing over 1,000 men a day on the front line, and they can barely replace about 20% of them. So, you know, things are looking very, very desperate for the Russians. In the Russian media, even today in the Russian papers, there is a lot of discourse. There are even some of the commentators and ex-military people who are beginning to criticize Putin, which is almost unheard of. And Putin has had to shut down the internet in Moscow and elsewhere to try and quell down the dissent. But with the strategic attacks that Ukraine's managing to do now, you know, over 1,000 kilometers into Russia, allegedly taking down over 50% of Russia's ability to produce and sell oil and petrol, which is the lifeblood of the Russian economy. And we know that the interest rates and inflation are through the roof. And, you know, I was only hearing on Radio 4, an hour ago from Russian commentators, you know, saying, you know, the prices of virtually every food have gone up by about 60% just this year. So things are absolutely desperate. And you've got one leader who is being so paranoid now, rarely seen in public, or a little choreographed meeting with an alleged old school teacher this week, which sort of didn't really fool anybody. We understand that nobody with a mobile phone is allowed anywhere near Putin. Apparently, he is completely paranoid after seeing the Iranian leadership pretty much assassinated in whole, allegedly by the US and Israeli targeting their mobile phones. So you put all this together, and things are not looking great. And also, I think you look at what President Trump's up to. You know, he enforced this 3-day ceasefire, and things are perhaps not going as he thought they would in the Middle East. But with his midterms coming up, he's desperate for a success. And I think Putin is really concerned that if he decided to turn the screw in Ukraine, then things would go bad. So going back to what we're seeing in the last sort of few days are these massive drone and missile attacks, and a lot of them double tap. And what I mean by that is they'll have a missile or a drone attack on a particular area, and then about 10 minutes later, they'll repeat it just when the emergency services and first responders are getting there. And what is really significant about what we've seen in the last 24, 48 hours, virtually all the targets are civilian. They are, and virtually all the casualties and deaths are civilians and children. And not only is usually Russian attacks are at night, but now they're during the day. And this, this is, you know, it, it sort of appears to maybe be a final throw of the dice. When we know that when autocratic leaders and when Russian regimes are quaking, they're prepared to do almost anything, which makes it incredibly dangerous. And we know that Putin is desperate not to lose his strategic relevance. But at the moment, with everything else is going on, it's pretty irrelevant. Trump's focused on China and the Middle East, and Putin is looking pretty desperate. Well, I think one has to understand how Russian leadership works. It's not what we'd recognize in the West, certainly not what we'd recognize in this country. It is very, very autocratic. He controls virtually everything, and also down to the lowest levels, which is why actually the Russian military has become so ineffective, because commanders below Putin are so terrified about making a mistake. We've seen so many of them being sacked, and so many senior leaders dying in mysterious circumstances. Well, probably not mysterious at all. They've probably just been got away with on Putin's orders. So people know that, and that's why he's been over 25 years remained in place, because of this absolute grip on power. But cracks seem to be appearing. The fact that he is rarely seen these days and does appear to be hiding away is because he's very fearful, primarily for assassination from the Ukrainian special forces and the Ukrainian Secret Service, who are incredibly effective. And the fact that Ukraine seems to be almost at will to attack Russian targets, almost unworried by air defense and Russian defense. I think this is really playing on Putin. Those in his close inner circle, there are these are rumors and mummerings that's happening, but this sort of small bow wave that started a few months ago is now getting quite significant. And I think when you see people criticizing him in the Russian press in Moscow, then there is a feeling that things are going badly for him. So he seems to be in control at the moment, but it's a sort of last throw of the dice. I mean, he looked very beleaguered at that victory parade. He was surrounded by a couple of autocratic leaders. Usually there would have been thousands of leaders there. The Chinese premier was there last year. This year he's with Trump. I mean, a hugely significant strategic sort of message to Putin. So at the moment, he's in control. This is not like the UK. This is not like the leadership of the prime minister or issues that Starmer's had at the moment. But it would be interesting perhaps in a few weeks' time to see who lasts longer, the UK prime minister or the Russian president. But he's certainly under significant pressure, and he sort of knows that if he doesn't deliver in Ukraine, then that is the sort of end of him. But his forces on the ground are just not doing the job, and will come up. His latest outburst was about his wonder weapon, the Satan II long range, hypersonic intercontinental ballistic missile, which he says is unstoppable and will change the war. But actually, certainly the analysis I've done and writing in the Telegraph today would suggest that is that is so far off the mark, it's almost laughable.
Will you be able to talk about the end of the war in Ukraine with the presidency?
I think it's getting very close. The end of the war in Ukraine, I really think it's getting very close.
Has there been any understanding between you and Putin that Russia should get entire Donbas?
No.
Well, I think he says the war might be coming to an end. It appears that President Trump is about to lean into this. There is lots of talks of ceasefire and peace deals. Now, we're in a very different position on the front lines now than we were when the last peace negotiations several months ago happened, and Putin knows that. And the last peace deal, so the Russians were offering, were freezing the front lines as they are at the moment, but Ukraine having to give up fast tracks of Zaporizhia and basically the whole of the Donbass, not being able to join NATO or the EU and a whole host of other things, and dismantling its military. Well, it's pretty clear that Ukraine is no way going to accept that, and Ukraine is in a much better bargaining position for it. Now, the most recent saber rattling is very much in the nuclear space, and some of his more strident supporters are suggesting the only way Russia can move forward now is to use tactical nuclear weapons in Ukraine itself. Now, I don't think, myself being an expert in nuclear proliferation and use, and I think all the other experts would agree that you can't just use a couple of strategic tactical nuclear weapons and expect not to be a retaliation in kind on a massive scale. There is no way, I think, he could drop a tactical nuclear weapon in Ukraine and not have the West retaliate massively. And whatever some of the people in the Russian media are saying, I'm pretty sure that he understands that. The whole idea of mutually assured destruction in the nuclear deterrence world is why we haven't had a global war since for the last 80 years plus, and why it's unlikely to happen. You then look at his saber rattling with his Satan II missile, which he claims can hit any US city or any European city with a massive warhead and destroy it and be unfettered by air defense. Again, it has no foundation. We know the Satan missile has actually been around for years. And, the last test launch before the one apparently last week, which was successful, the thing blew up on the launcher. And it's a part of a sort of family of missiles, hypersonic, that we've discussed before, various Iskander developments and everything else. And, the basic US Patriot missiles has been shooting them out of the sky in Ukraine. So why they think they can fire these at US cities and not be taken out by far more sophisticated air defense that the US have, then it's absolutely bonkers. And also Putin claim it will go 21,000 miles. Again, this is rubbish. We know at best it will go about 10 or 11,000 miles. And we also know that it is very unlikely to get anywhere near its target. But he seems to be, yet again, saying this is the battle-winning thing. This is why, I must get the peace, I must get the deal I need in Ukraine, because otherwise I'm going flat in the US and elsewhere. Nobody is believing him. And I don't even suppose people in Russia are believing him anymore, because they have seen, the 1.5 million body bags, or they might not have seen them because, of course, Russia's very careful with its propaganda and disinformation. But people generally know that the war has cost a huge amount, not only financially, but mostly in humans, over 1.5 million, 6,000 or 7,000 tanks, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And whatever spin he puts on it is really not going anywhere. So I think that's why a lot of us think that, the war might be over, because he's going to have to get to the peace negotiation table and try and get a ceasefire deal that's acceptable to the Russian people. Otherwise, he's finished. But that ceasefire deal is not going to be the one that he might have got a year ago, because he's very much on the back foot and President Zelensky's very much on the front foot.
We've had a fantastic relationship. We've gotten along. When there were difficulties, we worked it out. I would call you, and you would call me. Whenever we had a problem, people don't know. Whenever we had a problem, we worked it out very quickly. And we're going to have a fantastic future together.
Yes, I think this is probably quite an important piece. We know that they're talking about a lot of things about the war in Iran, the potential of Taiwan and its relationship with China. These are all almost unresolvable issues, I'd have thought, in a couple of days in Beijing. But I think certainly Russia is going to be put under a lot more pressure. It's clear that the Chinese premier realizes that the Chinese economy is suffering at the moment, and the US market is the biggest market for Chinese goods, and that is suffering because of tariffs and a whole host of other things. So I think the Chinese premier is much more interested in in sorting things out economically and financially with the Americans than anything else. And there are rumors that the Chinese have in the past supplied chips and other technology to Russia, which has helped them with their drones and everything else, and maybe some sort of munitions as well. But it would certainly, from the rhetoric coming out and the music coming out of Beijing, it would appear that China wants to see itself as an equal partner to Russia, to the USA, and not an adversary. And any involvement with Russia would absolutely dampen that. So yeah, I think this is going to be significant, which is why we're seeing, hopefully Putin in the last throes of his leadership and reign, which is why he appears to be throwing the Russian kitchen sink at Ukraine and targeting civilians, because it seems to be his mentality. And I saw it in Syria, admittedly a few years ago now, where the Syrians and the Russians killed as many civilians as they could because they thought that would be the best way to win. But actually, it didn't. And ultimately, of course, Assad was disposed and the Russians were kicked out of Syria. They seem to be repeating that sort of modus operandi now. And one just knows it's not going to work. But I suppose he feels there's nothing else he can do. He talks about his wonder weapons, but even some experts like myself and others can unpick that pretty easily. So yeah, China has an important role to play, and let's hope that we get some really good sort of sound bites coming out of Beijing in the next few days, which again will put additional pressure on Putin to get to the negotiation table, because I think everybody except Putin wants a just peace deal for Ukraine. And once we get peace in Europe, then we can really, all of us can start moving forward in a much more positive atmosphere.